The Bandidos and the Hells Angels, two of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in the world. For decades, these rival gangs have been locked in a brutal, bloody feud that sparked violence across the globe. From shootouts to bombings, the clashes between these two groups have left a trail of destruction. But what's behind this intense rivalry? Is it just about turf, or is there something deeper fueling the hatred? In this video, we're diving into the legendary and violent feud that has shaped the world of outlaw bikers. Get ready, because we're about to explore one of the most dangerous rivalries ever. If you've ever heard of outlaw biker clubs, you've probably come across the names Hells Angels and Bandidos. These two groups are the epitome of rebellion and toughness, with decades of history built on speed, chaos, and rivalry. But how did these two clubs come to be such massive forces in the world of outlaw motorcycle gangs? Let's start with the Hells Angels. Founded in 1948 in California, the Hells Angels grew quickly into an international symbol of freedom, defiance, and, yes, trouble. The club wasn't just about riding bikes, it was about living life outside the law. They adopted the 1% patch, a symbol that came from a statement made by the American Motorcyclist Association, who claimed 99% of riders were law-abiding, leaving the other 1% to be the rebellious outcast types. Naturally, the Hells Angels proudly embraced that identity. They began expanding in the 1960s, stretching their roots across the United States and then internationally. They weren't just a bike club, they were a brotherhood, united by a common code of living life on the edge. But here's the twist. When you have one club becoming this powerful, it creates room for others to rise. Enter the Bandidos. Formed in 1966 in Texas by a guy named Don Chambers, the Bandidos were set on creating their own version of an outlaw biker club. They quickly built their own reputation, not just in the US, but around the globe. They took the same rebellious spirit and pushed it further, creating their own network of chapters, members, and influence. Their motto? "We are the people your parents warned you about." It was the same idea: freedom, defiance, and a life lived on their own terms. Now, at first, the Hells Angels and the Bandidos were just two clubs, doing their own thing. But the more they grew, the more they crossed paths. And when you get two powerful forces clashing, things can get messy. It didn't take long before the Bandidos began expanding into territories where the Hells Angels had already staked their claim. And that's when the trouble began. In the early years, it wasn't all-out war, but the tension was building. Both clubs were fighting for influence, territory, and control. The Hells Angels had the edge in terms of reputation. They were bigger, more established. But the Bandidos, fresh with their own ambitions, weren't going to just back down. And it didn't take long for the rivalry to turn violent. The first major clash that people often point to came in the early 1980s, as both clubs started moving into Europe. The Hells Angels had already set up shop in Denmark, but the Bandidos were right behind them, determined to stake their own claim. This was the beginning of a feud that would only escalate over the years. You could almost feel the tension building up, like a fuse waiting to explode. But at this point, it was still just a simmering rivalry. Nothing major had happened yet. But it was the 90s when things really started to heat up. By now, the Bandidos were spreading even faster. They were expanding into places where the Hells Angels had been operating for years, territory that was, to them, sacred. In Europe in particular, the two clubs were clashing over turf, fighting for control of the drug trade, and in some cases, even trying to muscle their way into each other's local businesses. It was more than just about bikes at this point. It was about power, influence, and the ability to rule over a territory. While the Hells Angels might have been established first, the Bandidos were hungry. They weren't backing down, and the more they pushed, the more the violence between the clubs would soon explode. But in the beginning, it was still about asserting dominance, claiming territory, and proving who had the right to call the shots. So, why did it all get so personal? What turned a rivalry over territory and control into a full-blown war? The answer's complicated. The Bandidos and Hells Angels weren't just fighting over land or profits. They were fighting for respect, for identity, and for recognition as the top dog in the outlaw biker world. That's what made the rivalry so intense and dangerous. It wasn't just about bikes anymore. It was about everything both clubs stood for. At this point, we're still in the early days of the rivalry. Things haven't quite reached the explosive violence that would come later, but the groundwork is being laid. The clash of egos, the battle for dominance, it's all brewing, and soon enough, the situation's going to blow up. And when it does, you'll see just how bloody and brutal the war between the Hells Angels and the Bandidos really becomes. Now, let's fast forward a few years. The rivalry between the Hells Angels and the Bandidos wasn't just limited to the streets of America or the backroads of Texas. No, this feud was about to go global, and it all kicks off in a place that you might not expect: Scandinavia. In the 1980s, the Hells Angels decided to expand their influence into Europe, with Denmark being one of the first countries where they set up shop. They weren't just looking to ride their bikes and have fun. They were also eyeing control over the lucrative underground markets that were growing across the continent. Drug trafficking, arms dealing, and illegal trade were all on the rise, and the Hells Angels wanted in. They quickly established a stronghold in Denmark, and soon enough, they were looking to expand into neighboring countries like Sweden and Norway. By the early 1990s, the Bandidos had set their sights on Scandinavia too. And when they made their move, they didn't just ride in quietly. They barged into Denmark, right into the Hells Angels territory. This wasn't just about a few guys riding their bikes through the same city. This was a direct challenge. The Bandidos weren't trying to share territory. They were out to take over. What happened next was nothing short of a war. This wasn't some minor spat over turf. It was a brutal, bloody conflict that left its mark on Scandinavian soil, with both clubs willing to go to extreme lengths to prove who was in charge. It started small. Some altercations here and there, a few fistfights, some threats, but soon, things got much more serious. You can imagine how a few gangsters with a few too many beers could lead to a brawl, but when you've got two heavily armed, well-organized clubs going at it, things get deadly real fast. The most infamous incident of this war came on October 6, 1996, during a Hells Angels Viking party in Copenhagen. It was supposed to be a celebration, a night of partying, but it ended in chaos when a rocket-propelled grenade was launched into the crowd. The blast killed 2 people and injured several others. This wasn't just a street brawl anymore. This was full-scale warfare. The attack was a turning point. It wasn't just a message anymore. It was a declaration of war. The Hells Angels weren't going to stand down, and neither were the Bandidos. The killings marked a new chapter in the feud, one where both sides were willing to use any means necessary to maintain control. Police couldn't ignore it any longer. The violence was out of control, and the government started taking action. In Denmark, the Rocker Act was introduced, giving the police the power to evict motorcycle clubs from their clubhouses and crack down on their activities. Despite all of this, the war raged on for several more years. Throughout the late 90s, the Bandidos and the Hells Angels continued to battle for supremacy. It wasn't just a war of violence, though. It was also a war of influence. Both clubs were trying to stake their claim on the underground criminal economy, each trying to outdo the other in the drug trade, illegal businesses, and protection rackets. The Bandidos, still relatively new to the scene, had a lot to prove. The Hells Angels, however, weren't about to let anyone push them out of the spotlight. They had established their dominance over decades, and they weren't about to hand it over without a fight. Now, at this point, it may seem like things were getting completely out of hand, but there was a glimmer of hope. By 1997, after years of violence and destruction, both sides were exhausted. The police were putting pressure on them, public opinion was turning against them, and the violence was beginning to affect the business operations of both clubs. That's when a peace agreement was finally brokered between the two sides, bringing the Nordic Biker War to a close. But don't mistake this for a happy ending. Sure, the fighting stopped, but the animosity between the Bandidos and the Hells Angels didn't disappear. The truce was fragile, and although there was a ceasefire in Scandinavia, the rivalry would continue to simmer beneath the surface, ready to boil over at any moment. So, did this truce mean the end of the war? Well, not quite. The battle for control of the global biker world was far from over. By the late 1990s, the Nordic Biker War may have ended, but the rivalry between the Hells Angels and the Bandidos was far from over. In fact, this was just the beginning of an even bigger battle. With their influence already established in the Americas and Europe, both clubs had their eyes set on expanding into new territories. And, as you might expect, their clashes weren't limited to the quiet streets of Copenhagen or the Scandinavian backroads. No, the fight for supremacy was about to go global. In the US, the Hells Angels were already well established as one of the most powerful motorcycle clubs in the world. They had chapters spread across the country and had built a stronghold in states like California, Nevada, and Florida. But the Bandidos weren't about to let that slide. Having carved out a solid presence in Europe and parts of Asia, they set their sights on the US in the early 2000s, aiming to challenge the Hells Angels' grip on American soil. The Bandidos began to infiltrate territories previously dominated by the Hells Angels, especially in the South and Southwest. Texas was the club's first major target. After all, it's where the Bandidos originated, so their presence there made sense. But it wasn't long before they were trying to push into other areas, sparking a wave of tension with the Hells Angels, who didn't take kindly to the competition. The result? A new chapter in the rivalry, one that saw violent clashes erupt across the US. Over the next decade, both clubs would engage in several high-profile conflicts that would go down in biker lore as some of the most brutal encounters of their entire feud. One of the most notorious incidents in this new wave of conflict occurred in 2006 in Canada. A full-on gang war broke out between the Hells Angels and the Bandidos after the Bandidos attempted to take control of drug trafficking routes in Quebec, a region that the Hells Angels had long held under their influence. What began as small skirmishes soon escalated into bombings, shootings, and the ruthless execution of several Hells Angels members by the Bandidos. This marked a dark period in the rivalry, as both clubs engaged in a brutal game of one-upmanship, where no one was safe. But the violence wasn't just about control of drug routes, it was about respect, the kind of respect that comes with power in the criminal underworld. Both clubs were fiercely protective of their territories and their reputations, and this new phase of their rivalry wasn't just about territory, it was about asserting dominance on a global scale. To the Hells Angels, the Bandidos' attempts to muscle in were an insult. For the Bandidos, taking on the Hells Angels head-on was the only way to make a name for themselves in the world of outlaw bikers. As the 2000s wore on, the Hells Angels responded with violent retaliation. Over the years, there were several bombings in Europe, shootings in the US, and even knife attacks at the Bandidos and the Hells Angels, two of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in the world. For decades, these rival gangs have been locked in a brutal, bloody feud that sparked violence across the globe. From shootouts to bombings, the clashes between these two groups have left a trail of destruction. But what's behind this intense rivalry? Is it just about turf, or is there something deeper fueling the hatred? In this video, we're diving into the legendary and violent feud that has shaped the world of outlaw bikers. Get ready, because we're about to explore one of the most dangerous rivalries ever: rallies. Law enforcement agencies across the world started to take notice as the Hells Angels and the Bandidos became more brazen in their actions. The rivalry was no longer just a local issue, it was becoming an international problem, attracting the attention of authorities and the media alike. Yet, despite all this chaos, there was also an element of order to the madness. Both clubs had extensive networks that helped them maintain their positions in various countries, including everything from local businesses to international crime rings. The Bandidos, while growing in power, often found themselves on the defensive against the long-established Hells Angels. At this point, the clubs were no longer just fighting over territory or drugs. They were fighting for the title of the world's most powerful outlaw motorcycle club. The stakes were higher, the violence more frequent, and the strategies more sophisticated. But let's not get it twisted. This wasn't all about criminal empires and battles for control. There was still the deep personal animosity between the two clubs. For both the Hells Angels and the Bandidos, it wasn't just about money. It was about being seen as the top dog in the world of outlaw bikers. Whoever came out on top would set the tone for the entire biker community. And for both clubs, losing wasn't an option. In the end, both clubs continued their worldwide expansion. But the battles they fought were far from over. As they continued to grow, new rivalries would form, new enemies would emerge, and the Hells Angels and Bandidos would remain locked in a cycle of violence, one-upmanship, and attempts at domination. And while the conflict shifted from region to region, one thing remained constant: the feud was far from finished. As the rivalry between the Hells Angels and Bandidos continued to spread across the globe, the violence became harder to ignore. The tension was no longer just a series of local incidents or isolated events. It was a full-on, high-stakes war, and it wasn't only about bikes and turf. It was about survival. Both clubs were willing to go to any lengths to prove who was in charge, And in doing so, they left behind a trail of bloodshed. One of the most notorious incidents in this brutal war occurred in Canada in 2006. A series of killings, bombings, and turf battles erupted after the Bandidos attempted to take over drug trafficking routes in Quebec, an area the Hells Angels had long controlled. What started as a few small clashes soon turned into a series of murders, as the Bandidos took things to the extreme. The most chilling of these attacks involved the execution-style killings of several Hells Angels members. The violence escalated quickly, turning the region into a war zone. At the same time, the Hells Angels weren't sitting back quietly. They were determined to retaliate and make sure they didn't lose their grip on what they saw as their territory. In fact, this war became one of the deadliest and most intense periods of violence between the two clubs. The public had never seen anything like it. It wasn't just street fights, and it wasn't only the Canadians who were impacted. The war spilled into the US as well, with shootouts and bombings becoming more frequent. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in Texas in 2015, when a deadly shootout took place between rival bikers at the Twin Peaks restaurant in Waco. What started as a routine meetup quickly turned into one of the most violent clashes in modern biker history, leaving 9 people dead and dozens injured. Law enforcement had to step in, with armed officers swarming the scene to contain the chaos. For many, this event symbolized the very real threat posed by the Hells Angels and Bandidos, and it sent a message that this war wasn't slowing down anytime soon. But it wasn't just in the US or Canada where the blood was being spilled. Europe became another hotspot for deadly violence. In Germany, for example, the two clubs would clash repeatedly in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the Bandidos made a concerted effort to move into Hells Angels turf. The violence was brutal and indiscriminate. Knife fights, shootings, and even arson attacks became common occurrences. In some cities, the streets were ruled by fear, as both clubs tried to outdo each other in their ruthlessness. By the mid-2000s, both the Hells Angels and the Bandidos had become symbols of a much larger problem: the growing influence of outlaw motorcycle gangs and organized crime. As both clubs sought control over drug routes, protection rackets, and illegal businesses, their turf wars became increasingly deadly. The violence wasn't just a display of power, it was a message. It was a warning to anyone who might stand in their way, anyone who might challenge their authority. And for a long time, no one could stop them. The extreme violence wasn't just a random occurrence. Both clubs had intricate networks set up to carry out their operations, which meant that when a fight broke out, it was a battle between well-organized, armed factions with years of experience. This wasn't a street gang clash. This was a highly structured criminal operation in full motion. Shootouts, bombings, kidnappings, and executions became a regular part of the violence between the two. The sheer scale of the bloodshed left a scar on both clubs and on the countries where they operated. But amid all the bloodshed, there was a certain dark glory to the violence for both clubs. It wasn't just about protecting their turf. It was about maintaining a reputation. In the world of outlaw bikers, reputation is everything. The Hells Angels and the Bandidos fought to prove who was the most powerful. And in doing so, they created a culture of violence and fear that would define the rivalry for years to come. Yet, even in the midst of all this violence, there were moments of weird, dark irony. Despite everything, both sides respected each other in a twisted way. They knew what the other club was capable of, and they knew that this was a fight that could never truly end. Both clubs were locked in a battle they couldn't walk away from, because to do so would mean losing everything they'd fought for. As the years went on, the violence continued. No matter how many times the police tried to shut them down or force a peace, it was clear that this was a rivalry that couldn't be easily contained. The bloodshed wasn't just a result of competition. It was part of the fabric of the biker world, a reality that both the Hells Angels and the Bandidos had embraced. So, as we look at the history of the bloodshed between these two clubs, it's clear that the war between the Hells Angels and Bandidos was about more than just control. It was about pride, power, and proving who really ruled the outlaw world. And when you have that much at stake, there's no telling just how far people will go to protect it. As the violent clashes between the Hells Angels and the Bandidos continued to escalate, authorities began to take notice. What had started as localized incidents of violence turned into something much larger and more dangerous. This wasn't just about rival motorcycle clubs anymore. It was about organized crime, illegal trade, and bloodshed that was spiraling out of control. The Hells Angels and Bandidos were no longer only threatening each other, they were threatening the safety of entire cities, and it became impossible for law enforcement to ignore. In the early 2000s, police across the US and Europe began ramping up their efforts to take down these clubs. The FBI, Interpol, and local law enforcement agencies all joined forces to crack down on the rising tide of violence. For years, the police had been aware of the Bandidos and Hells Angels' criminal activities, drug trafficking, extortion, weapons smuggling, and more. But now, they had to do something about it. The pressure from the public, who were growing increasingly terrified of the biker wars spilling into their communities, was pushing law enforcement to act. One of the biggest moments in this crackdown came in 2001, when Operation Black Friday targeted the Hells Angels in California. For months, law enforcement had been gathering intelligence, building cases, and tracking the movements of key members. The goal was to take down the Hells Angels' leadership and cripple their operations once and for all. In a series of raids across multiple cities, the FBI arrested dozens of Hells Angels members, charging them with everything from drug trafficking to racketeering. This operation sent shockwaves through the biker community, signaling that the authorities were no longer going to stand by and watch the violence unfold. But it wasn't just the Hells Angels who were feeling the heat. The Bandidos were also in the crosshairs. In 2006, the Bandidos made headlines with a violent altercation in Texas, where they were involved in a shootout at a Twin Peaks restaurant in Waco. This wasn't just another scuffle. This was a public spectacle that put the Bandidos under serious scrutiny. 9 people were killed and dozens more were injured. The police immediately swooped in, arresting dozens of Bandidos members. It was a major blow to their operations in the US, and the incident raised alarms about just how far the violence had reached. The situation wasn't much better in Europe. Over the years, several high-profile incidents, like the Quebec massacre, put pressure on law enforcement to take a more aggressive approach to stopping the spread of biker violence. In Germany, for example, the police began using undercover agents to infiltrate both clubs, gathering critical information about their operations and members. This led to the Raubritter operation in 2009, which targeted the Bandidos in Europe. Several key Bandidos leaders were arrested, and police seized a large amount of illegal weapons, drugs, and money. The coordinated effort by international law enforcement was starting to show results. By the early 2010s, both the Hells Angels and the Bandidos were facing serious setbacks. Members were being arrested, clubhouses were being raided, and their criminal enterprises were being dismantled. But this didn't stop the war, it just made it more underground. Despite the police pressure, both clubs were resourceful. They didn't just rely on violence, they knew how to adapt. Even with the crackdown, the Hells Angels and Bandidos found new ways to operate, using more covert methods to continue their activities. But the continuous surveillance and infiltration by law enforcement had a real impact, slowing down their operations and putting them on the defensive. By 2017, both clubs had been dealt some major blows, but the criminal underworld in which they operated was still alive and well. The violence, though somewhat quieter, never truly stopped. Authorities remained vigilant, and biker gangs continued to thrive in the shadows. It's important to remember that these efforts to shut down the Hells Angels and the Bandidos weren't just about preventing violence. They were also about stopping the massive criminal enterprises that fueled much of the conflict. Both clubs were heavily involved in the global drug trade, illegal arms dealing, and various other criminal activities. And law enforcement knew that taking them down was crucial for making the world a safer place. Despite all these efforts, the question remains: will the law ever be able to fully eliminate the Hells Angels and Bandidos from the streets? As much as they've been brought to the brink of extinction by crackdowns, both clubs have proved time and time again that they're not easily wiped out. They may be knocked down, but they're never out for good. The violence may have slowed, but the rivalry between the Bandidos and Hells Angels continues to linger in the shadows. The clubs have adapted to the law's pressure, continuing to operate under the radar. So, while law enforcement might have succeeded in pushing them back, the war between these two legendary motorcycle clubs is far from over. After years of violent clashes, police crackdowns, and global expansion, the legacy of the Hells Angels and Bandidos rivalry remains as fierce as ever. Sure, the extreme bloodshed, has slowed in recent years, but don't be fooled. The hatred between these two clubs still runs deep. These are two clubs that have defined the outlaw biker world for decades, and their rivalry is not just a thing of the past, it's a part of their DNA. What makes this feud so fascinating and so dangerous is the sheer scale of it. It's not just a competition between two groups of guys who like to ride motorbikes. This is a clash between two criminal empires, fighting for power, respect, and control over vast swathes of territory. And in the world of outlaw bikers, that means violence is almost always the answer. Even when the law cracks down or public opinion turns against them, the Hells Angels and Bandidos have managed to find a way to keep going. But what does the future hold? Well, the truth is, no one really knows. The Bandidos have managed to establish themselves as a global force, while the Hells Angels, despite their years of dominance, are facing more competition than ever before. In many ways, both clubs have already achieved legendary status in the world of outlaw bikers. Yet, their struggle for dominance continues. As both clubs grow in size and influence, they may have to shift their tactics. With law enforcement always lurking and public scrutiny at an all-time high, the days of open shootouts and bombings might be over. But the underground world in which these clubs operate hasn't disappeared. It's just changed shape. They're still out there, running illegal enterprises, controlling drug routes, and maintaining that all-important reputation. Whether it's in shady bars or secluded clubhouses, the rivalry between the Hells Angels and the Bandidos rages on, though it may be fought in quieter, more hidden ways. What's certain is that the story of this rivalry is far from over. While the days of bloody showdowns in public places may be behind us, the club's battle for supremacy continues, albeit in a more subtle manner. The Hells Angels and Bandidos remain locked in a strange, ever-evolving competition. A war that spans decades, continents, and cultures, fueled by egos, money, and a deep-seated need to prove who truly rules the outlaw biker world. In the end, these two clubs have become something larger than life, symbols of rebellion, violence, and power. For some, they're legends. For others, they're just a reminder of the darker side of human nature. Either way, the story of the Hells Angels and the Bandidos is a testament to the lengths people will go to for control, respect, and the twisted sense of loyalty that keeps them going. And while the full-scale battles might have faded, the rivalry between the Hells Angels and Bandidos has left an indelible mark on the world. One thing is for sure, this is a story that won't be forgotten anytime soon. With that, the saga of the Bandidos versus Hells Angels, bloody, intense, and undeniably iconic, remains part of the biker world's complicated history. But for anyone who dares to dive into it, one thing's clear: the legacy of this legendary feud will continue to shape the world of outlaw bikers for generations to come.